Okay, everyone, we'll get underway. What I would like to show you now is a short video from Trevor Taylor on behalf of Miracle Water. We didn't want to avoid the water bottling issue, and Trevor is unfortunately away, but his company is largely the one that has generated the controversy around water bottling. His company is joint Chinese owned and now has iwi ownership as well, and they export or are trying to export bladdered water effectively to China to mix with milk powder. Now, while the volumes sound huge, it's important that I say at the beginning that they've actually so far been unsuccessful in making that happen, largely because the plastic bladders and the time it gets from here to China have been leaching a taint into the water. So it's biologically sound, but there's a small taste in the water, and they haven't fixed that. So while there's a big plant, and everybody's concerned about it, they've actually hardly bottled any water from the day it was opened. Now, they will eventually get on top of that, and they'll start production, but at the moment they haven't. So I asked Trevor to make this video because we didn't want to avoid the water bottling issue. We know it's controversial, but we asked him to make this video. I haven't seen it, but I'd ask that we play it now, and then we'll have a short period of questions before we get on to the next presentations.
Hello, my name is Trevor Taylor. I am the Managing Director of Elwood Road Holdings Limited in Hastings. My family owns 75% of that company, and the other 25% is held by Mangaharuru Tangata Trust. We are developing the Tomoana Food Hub. Elwood Road Holdings Limited had held a water consent for 386,000 cubic metres for some 7 years. We never had any dissent about that consent. I was introduced to Chinese resident New Zealanders through Business Hawke's Bay in 2015 who wished to set up a water processing plant. They had been exporting infant formula out of New Zealand prior to that. We entered into a 50-50 joint venture between Elwood Road Holdings Limited and New Zealand New Water Limited, and then set up a operating company called New Zealand Miracle Water, of which I am also a director. We increased the water consent to 820,000 cubic metres to come in over a 3-year period. To gain that consent, we needed to have some scientific testing of our bores. This was done by a geoscientist, and part of that entailed pumping 90 litres per second out of the bore for some 48 hours and monitoring some 6 bores within a 1 kilometre radius of this site. Interestingly enough, it had nil impact on any of those bores, and it was actually during November 2015, which most of the irrigators in the area were busy. The benefits as we see it in Hawke's Bay is that we have spent $10 million on a new factory, utilising totally local engineers, designers, builders. We've spent some $5 million on plant and equipment in the factory and engaged engineers and fitters to assemble that. We're hoping to employ, or expecting to employ, some 60 odd staff when the factory is in full production. The factory purchases multiple supplies throughout the area, from packaging, transport, port services, accounting services, electrical services, etc. Our bore details, we put an 80-metre bore down, and it's 300 mils, and lined it with a stainless steel liner. That water is artesian in the confined aquifer. It actually comes out of the ground under pressure. We then put that through pumps and through a significant filtration system including UV and ozone, before we actually package that. This company is primarily packaging into this 7-litre bladder, and that goes into a dispenser and is targeting the new mother in Asia who is looking for pure water to mix with the infant baby formula. I have been here in Hastings for some 70 years, and whilst I'm not a scientist, I have observed what has been happening in this area over that period of time. We've seen a change in orcharding from 13,500 hectares down to 9,500 hectares. I've seen factories such as Leopard Breweries in St Albans Street, Jaiwadi Foods, or canneries as they were, in King Street, Tamuana Meatworks, Tamuana Woolscour, Wakatu Meatworks, W Tucker Limited Woolscour, and Louis Woods Woolscour in Awatoto. They were all huge users of water, probably not even monitored years back. Very few of those companies remain today, so that demand for water has declined. Today I think we have Heinz Whitey and Cavalier Woolscour, the only two significant users of water in this area. I believe that the area from Hastings City to Awatoto is the sweet spot of where our artesian water is in the confined aquifer. Now the question, of course, is should water be paid for? Maybe it should, but then should not the breweries, the wineries, the food processors, the dairy farmers, the horticulturalists, apple orchardists, the Woolscours all pay for water? And it's also of interest that many of those companies now on the Hiratonga Plains are 100% foreign owned. With regards to water bottling, we see these consents that have been issued which look quite significant, some in excess of 1 million cubic metres per annum. Personally, I do not believe that many of those companies will get established, and they will certainly never use the maximum amount of water consent that they have. Historically, water bottlers have had difficulty in surviving, and in fact 90% water bottlers throughout the world fail for one reason or another. So I think that there's I personally believe there's probably a hysteria around the amount of water that's to be taken.
Okay, Trevor would have been here. He would have been happy to front up. That is a perspective. Are there any questions before we move on to the next part? And I'm happy to come back to it later in the day. Are there any question on water bottling specifically? There aren't. Oh, yes, one. Yes, Barry.
The difference I see is that the water bottling company is not creating their own product. They're given the product. Whereas all the other instances and examples like Heinz Whitey and that actually develop the water into a product that they sell. So he's not buying the essential ingredients, the bottler, whereas the others have to buy their essential ingredients to make a product.
Yep, I understand that's a perspective, but I think what Trevor's saying is that he would be happy to pay if there was a charge on the water, but he just thinks a whole lot of other companies, including those that are foreign owned, like Heinz Whitey, McCain's, they actually should pay as well. That's the challenge. That's really what he's saying. Ma'am?
And I don't think we should be put off because of that.
Yep.
You know, because I think this is always the idea that we're going to make people pay, so then everybody's going to pay, and then it just gets big, and so we all run away from it.
Yep.
The other thing that I'm just interested in, I'm sure you probably can't tell me exactly, but I have heard it described about what that sort of usage or take actually looks like, in far as like railway containers worth in a day.
I can't remember the exact number, but yesterday I said, yes, it's huge. Yesterday I said 180 jobs and he quoted 60. So there's 60 on site, but the logistics of getting all that to the port and trucks and all the rest of it makes up for the other stuff. It is significant. The only number I can give you a context on is that Brookvale Bore 3, which is currently supplying this side of Havelock North Limited network, is currently flowing at 100 litres a second. At full production, he tested at 90 litres a second. So that's the sort of scale of it.
It is a considerable scale then, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. And I think that's what we really need to consider.
So I'll just reiterate what I said yesterday, which is factually correct. So in New Zealand, it is illegal to charge for water, so there would have to be a law change. And equally in New Zealand, it is illegal to ban water bottling in the current model of framework, so that would require a law change as well. And that's currently being looked at by all political parties, but at the moment the Regional Council have allocated water based on the current RMA, and the only thing they've done recently to try and tighten up further is to say that all water bottling consents will be publicly notified, which is a new, so that was not publicly notified, that consent, but they will be now. Two more. Yes, David?
No, I won't get up. Lawrence, you spoke to me a while ago about the default answer to people who are against water bottling plants or exporting our water. You and others have said it's only 2% of the water flowing out to sea. Now, my question to you is, how do you or any scientist know that when when work hasn't been really done on it, and as Kerry said in her thing, the seminal work of the Dravid-Brown report is still the seminal work of understanding our aquifers. So until that happens, until we know more about aquifers, and perhaps if you get into Parliament, you could, as you said yesterday, you can spearhead a change the act that we stop exporting, because charity begins at home. And until we understand how much water we've got beneath the ground here and the recharge, we just shouldn't be exporting or giving it away to China or anybody else. So, and my second part of the question is as that fella said, Trevor, if that's the sweet spot of the Herotong aquifers, why not municipal water supply for Havelock go there instead of in this contaminated aquifer just behind you in Brookvale Road?
Yes, that's a good question. The second one first. We know that there are deeper aquifers in the Hamoana, Timona area. That's why many of those companies were there. Next to the railway line, lots of artesian water that came out. But as my staff said previously today, in our well at Whakatū, which is 40 metres deep, we have recently found young water less than 2 years old. Now, we can go and drill deeper wells and deeper all over in supposedly sweet spots, but until we understand what the young water means, it might actually not be the right thing. We might actually be better to treat the water as opposed to finding new water, because at the moment we do not understand where the young water is, how widespread it is, what's causing it and where it may get to. And I'll refer to that map yesterday where they put up how permeable our aquifers are compared with most other parts of New Zealand. So it's a state of unknown, I think, and all we're trying to do in the meantime is treat your water with UV where we know it's not confined and we've got young water as we work out what to do next. And we have 5 million in our plan to look for new water.
Well, with due respect, it's not answering the question. I mean, if the sweet spot where miracle water is coming from, is that young water?
That hasn't been tested yet. We don't know. Okay, so that's all part of the testing that the Hawke's Bay Regional Council is doing, because this discovery of young water is a recent phenomenon. It hadn't been there before, and we can't explain it, and we're trying to understand it. In the meantime, we're trying to keep you as safe as we can by all the sources where we found young water. Next one.
Lawrence, the water is an issue on one side, but there's another issue with bottled water, and that is the bottle.
Yep.
Plastic is one of the greatest environmental disasters of our time. And I know that lots of other stuff comes in plastic, but how much awareness is there that selling this stuff off is just contributing massively to the plastic disaster?
I'm certainly aware of it, and I've seen videos of beaches all around the world with bottles and those bladders, so I'm acutely aware of it. The problem is, in the framework we operate under, if somebody wants to put a water bottling plant in, they're considered exactly the same way as an irrigator or another industrial user. If under current law, if the water's there and you're not impacting on your neighbours when you draw it off at the amount, you're allowed to use it. As I said, the only way that that can be changed is under a regional policy statement or a government legislative change. So I completely get the issue you're raising, and it's no different to the coffee cups yesterday. 297 million coffee cups we consume in New Zealand. Well, actually, we probably have a pretty serious look at ourselves as to say, why are we doing that? All right? Okay, thank you. I'm happy to come back to it if there's other questions more generally, but I now want to move on to the primary sector. And I have three speakers. Please come up. Well, Guy and Jeff, where are you? Here he is. Have a seat. So we're going to look at this. Guy Salmon's going to speak first. And Guy and I have been at a symposium already this week nationally on water. And I'd have to say that Guy is a man ahead of his time. And I said this then, and I'm saying it again. He has been talking about a lot of this stuff for a long, long time, and a lot of people haven't really been listening. But we should have been. So it's my pleasure to invite Guy, who is the Executive Director of Ecologic Foundation, to talk about methods of effective water use, achieving sustainable allocation, and a polluter pays framework. Welcome, Guy.
Well, thank you, Lawrence, for those kind words of introduction. Kia ora, everyone. I am actually a South Islander, and so as a result, I probably know less about Hawke's Bay than anyone else in this room. Down the South Island, we still think that modesty is a good quality, so I thought I'd just put that out there to start with. I'm going to talk about some general principles. Most of them derive from the Land and Water Forum, which is a national body. They won't necessarily apply to Hawke's Bay. Whether they do or not is for you folk to decide for yourselves. So I just wanted to say that I'm not coming here to give you a recipe, but to open up some possibilities, really. You're going to need to test out these ideas in the context of the Heretaunga Plains and in the political context of Hawke's Bay and what people here actually want to do. And in the course of that, inevitably, I'm going to speak a bit about Maori rights and interests and responsibilities. I'm going to be guided by what I learnt from iwi representatives at the Land and Water Forum and by the iwi Chairs Forum's process that Tina Perot spoke with us about earlier today, but I certainly won't claim to speak for a Maori point of view, and I noticed Tina wasn't doing that either. And lastly, I'm going to talk quite a bit about environmental safeguards, but again, I'm not claiming to speak for the whole environment movement. I guess I am going to, though, try and follow pretty much what was broadly agreed within the Land and Water Forum, with the major exception that I'm going to talk about royalties because the organisers of this meeting asked me to do that, but that was not something agreed by the Land and Water Forum. It's still a controversial matter. And lastly, I should just add that all of the things I'm going to talk about assume that we're free to change the law of this country. I'm not sort of talking about what's possible within the existing law. I'm talking about what should the law really be like. And as I kind of lead into this, and just reflecting on the forum so far, it just strikes me that the biggest problem in water management is actually not a technical one. It's simply a question of how do we overcome all the divisions that have developed amongst us. I was really impressed with that opening session yesterday morning chaired by Nahui Tomoana. And two things for me sort of stood out. One was that this kind of holistic, relationship-based conception of water and people was something that has a lot to offer to all of us. And the second thing that stood out was that it's taken iwi Maori an awfully long time to get themselves into the room where the decisions are being made. And that seems to be a great shame and something which is really important for us to set right. And that's not just a reflection on Hawke's Bay, of course. I'm really speaking here about the whole national context, that every regional council has, there's very few Maori people around the table of regional councils, and they've, in every region, found it pretty hard to make their voice heard. And if I can go a step further, I belong to a sort of an iwi of environmentalists, I suppose, and I feel a little bit the same way. It's been pretty hard, really, for regional councils to hear environmental messages. And quite recently, we've kind of gone into a very polarised phase at the national level where there's a lot of criticism of farmers, and farmers are kind of hitting back and criticising environmentalists. And none of this seems to me to be really a good trend, because it's getting in the way of us actually listening to each other and working together on solutions. And I think there is a huge challenge in water management. We're going to have to make some really big changes in this country, particularly in the relation to the primary sector. We've really got to use a more collaborative approach if we're going to get these reforms that are needed across the line. And, regional councils, when they were set up in the late 1980s, had to produce regional policy statements by 1992, and they all did. And they all said they were going to improve the quality of water. And in every one of those regional council regions, the water quality has declined since they published those objectives. So there is an integrity problem in our water management system which has to be addressed, and there's a listening problem which has to be addressed, and that's really going to be a large part of what I'm going to speak about. So I thought, because these are controversial and complex issues, that I should try and lay down some building blocks which I thought were kind of uncontroversial. 5 building blocks that we might be able to all agree on just to start this discussion, and then I'd lead on from that. The first of these building blocks is the idea of efficiency. And it does seem to me that getting more efficiency in our use of water is something worth pursuing from every one of our different perspectives, It's obviously, efficiency is a motor of business and profitability. Efficiency is also, part of the Bible of environmentalism. And from a community point of view, if we can use water more efficiently, then we can get both more environmental goods from the water and we can get more economic good from the water. So going after efficiency is something that I would hope we can all agree on, and that can be one of those building blocks. A second building block, which I feel more confident about now than I did a few years ago, is that we can all agree that achieving ecologically healthy and swimmable freshwaters over time is something that's pretty generally supported. Now, I know it's often said that farmers are opposed to that. I don't think that's any longer the case. In fact, that photograph I've got up there of Lake Brunner is a kind of interesting example of what's happening around New Zealand at the moment. If you look in the foreground, you can see the farmers have humped and hollowed that land. A huge slug of sediment and phosphorus flowed into Lake Brunner, the lake behind. It went through a 17-year period of declining water quality. But in the last 5 years, the farmers have rallied round, partly through voluntary effort and partly through agreeing to a regional council regulation in the catchment. They've been able to stop the deterioration of the lake, and it has now reached the trophic level target for the water quality ahead of time. So it just seems to me we have turned a page here. If we can engage with farmers in the right way, as they've done down on the West Coast, we ought to be able to all together move toward these ecological goals. Let me just touch on another thing that used to be controversial and I think is becoming a lot less controversial, which is the idea that iwi and hapu, in fact, do have rights and interests in fresh water, and that these should be accommodated as long as it's done in a way that's fair to everybody else. Now, I know there's some people who don't feel comfortable about this as yet, but what I also know, because I spend a lot of time talking with politicians at the national level, is that both the main political parties are committed to righting this issue. And I think that whatever party wins the next election, we're going to see that this, something is going to happen in this space which is going to sort out what Maori feel has been a long-standing injustice. I'm sorry, I've gone too fast. Now, this is a bit more of a complex idea, I guess, but what kind of process or what kind of system do we want, and what kind of process of change do we want to design here? And it seems to me that the system we're looking for is going to have 4 characteristics. One of them is around promoting collaboration, which I've already spoken about. A second one's about accountability. And there's been a lot of publicity about farmers' poor compliance record, particularly in the dairy sector. But there's a larger picture as well, which I've already alluded to, which is that regional councils haven't really been accountable in terms of their own stated objectives. So they've told us that they're looking after the water, and in fact they haven't delivered on that. It hasn't improved, it's got worse. We've had some very bad incidents. And so we're also looking for a system of more robust accountability of the regional councillors. And then those last 2 words, flexibility and innovation, these seem absolutely vital. We've got to make some big changes here. We can only do that if we create quite a large envelope in which land users and investors can bring about change, and a way in which innovative water users can come into the picture, so that the water isn't all sewn up by people who are doing things the old way, but there are opportunities in there to drive change through flexibility and allow innovation to get a chance. And my last building block, was rather eloquently spoken to by Tina Perot. We've had a tradition, and this picture in Canterbury kind of illustrates it, where you allocate the water first, and if there's something left in the river afterwards, that's a good thing, but it often is just pretty much a trickle. We need to do things the other way around. We need to start by saying, what does the river need in terms of both quantity of water and its flow and its flushing capacity and all those things, and also in the quality of the water. And when we've defined all those things really clearly and robustly, and we've put in place really strong limits and objectives for looking after the water body, then if there's some water left over, then we can talk about allocating it to irrigators and to other users. We shouldn't be doing it the other way around as we've done in the past. So that leads me, I guess, directly to this question I've been asked to speak about of transferring water between users, or to put it more simply, trading in water, creating a water market. And a lot of people, I think, intuitively feel slightly uneasy about this idea. And you've got to ask, I think, right at the start, why would we want to do this? So I've tried to set out on this slide a few reasons why we ought to think about this idea and treat it reasonably seriously. The first one is perhaps a small point, but farmers, irrigators especially, have traditionally traded water. And that's been particularly the case during droughts, where you find that, a dairy farmer and a horticulturist in the same catchment, they need water at different times. They've got different tolerances for breaks in their water supply. They've traded between each other kind of informally. Often there's no payment involved, but sometimes there's a payment which is under the table. So there's a sort of a system that operates out there, which perhaps ought to be made more transparent, Those who are interested in, you know, the integrity of the tax system and whether there should be a royalty might like to see it more transparent as well. And so there's something there which we already have, which we're kind of talking about building on. The second point is that this is about reducing barriers to new entrants, because as soon as you have a water market, it becomes possible for an innovator, somebody who's got a new idea about how to make better use of that water, to buy a bit of water and come into the catchment without having to buy a whole farm. And that's a very important lowering of the barrier to innovation in our land use system. If we were able to do that, we'd have a much more dynamic responsiveness to our export opportunities and our people's ideas about new ways of earning a living. And if you think about this from an iwi and hapu point of view as well, there's an interesting opportunity for settling the claims which iwi are making over water in a way which is a voluntary transaction. So the Crown could approach this by saying, we've got tradability now established, here's a large pot of money for iwi in each region, and instead of just taking the water off the existing users, you guys can buy it off the existing users. And that just seems to me to set up a rather nice way of getting through this what could be a very difficult phase of how do we find some water for iwi Maori. Then there's a regional economic development benefit from water trading. And it comes really from ensuring that water can flow to its highest valued use over time. This is the flexibility in the system which seems to be so important for economic growth. And it also means that you get a more realistic understanding of the value of putting in a water storage impoundment. So at the moment, you know, it's quite difficult to economically justify an irrigation, a water storage project. But if you had a tradable water situation, a market in water, then what you would find is that water which flushes down from the mountains in the spring would have a very low price on it. And if you could impound that water, not necessarily in a large structure, possibly in quite a small farm structure, then you could sell that water again a little bit later in the summer when the water price goes up and it becomes scarce and valuable. So having tradable water permits would make it more feasible for people to justify economically investing in water impoundments. And the last reason for thinking about trading is that most New Zealand rivers are over-allocated. And the big problem we have is how can we get some of that water which at present is being taken away and restored back into the rivers. And if you just arbitrarily cut people's quota by 10% in order to put the 10% back in the river, you will find some people will go out of business. For some people, they'll face a very high cost in their business. And it's much better if we can use a market in which those who can really make economic use of the water buy it, and those who are looking after the public interest can ensure that the water that isn't highly valued can get back into the river. So I think trading looks a very promising way of helping us to restore many of the rivers that have got too little left in them. And if you can think also about what we did in Lake Taupo, which is to trade in nitrogen, which is a pollutant of the water, and then you also have a way through trading of finding a low-cost way of improving the health of the water body as well. So how would we set up a trading system in water? And the first thing that needs to be said is that a market doesn't work properly if there's not very many traders. So if you're in a very small stream and there's only a handful of farmers operating irrigation in that catchment, tradability is not something which is a serious proposition for that context. But if you're in a place like the Heretaunga Plains, where there's a lot of water users and a large aquifer, if we can understand it well enough, a point I'll come to in a moment, it ought to be possible to introduce a trading scheme. You obviously need to have everybody on a meter, and because we've introduced these water metering regulations, we're getting to a situation now where I think around about 97% of the water is being metered, and in a very short while we'll get it higher still. But you do need to, first of all, as I've already said, set limits on the water body. So you have to have a very clear idea about how much water is okay to put into a trading system after you've made allowance for the needs of the water body itself, and for drinking water and for all the other things that are sort of bottom lines, the part of te mana o te wai, as Tina would say. And then you need to define a trading envelope, which is to speak of a part of the catchment within which it's feasible to trade water without creating damaging off-site effects. So you have to define a part of an aquifer or a part of a catchment where if you took some water from one owner, one user, and took it across to another user, you wouldn't have an effect on the neighbours. You wouldn't have a depletion effect on a nearby stream, and you would perhaps, if you think about the problem of a river getting bigger as it gets closer to the sea, and you think about somebody wanting to transfer a right from the bottom part of the river and instead take the water further upstream, you might have to have a rule which says if you're going to transfer this water permit from the bottom end of the river to the top end of the river, then you're going to have to scale down the amount of water that you can take. So you need to set up this envelope of rules which make sure that the market can operate in a way which doesn't have an adverse effect on neighbours, on streams, or on the overall health of the river. There's also a huge issue around flow variability, and that becomes a pretty important issue when you're having a drought. So there's several ways that you can deal with that. You can issue a permit not for a fixed quantum of water, but rather for a percentage of the allowable flow. And then as you go into a drought period and that percentage, total flow that's available goes down, the entitlement of each water user shrinks by the same amount. That's one way of doing it. But that creates a problem for some people whose business very much depends on having absolute security about the quantity of water. Another way of approaching it, therefore, is to have two levels of priority in your permits. The A priority permits have a guarantee that the water will always be available to the user of the permit, and the B will have a risk that in dry conditions they may have to be cut off for a period until rain falls again. Or you could have a combination of those two systems. And there's a third way of addressing this flow variability problem, which is illustrated in my slide with that picture of Lake Opuha in South Canterbury, which simply is, it becomes immensely easier to run a water trading scheme if you have a water storage somewhere in the catchment. It doesn't have to be huge, but it just makes it easier to do water trading. Okay, I'm using up my time, so I'll whiz right on. There's a tension between the interests of the water user and that of the community. The water user wants to have a permit which is really secure, and the longer the term of that permit, the more you'll be able to attract investment. The community, though, also has an interest in making sure that the whole scheme is reversible if it goes wrong, and they want to be able to adapt to climate change, and so the thing needs to be capable of change. So permits to use water need to have expiry dates. There needs to be a portion of the water that gets auctioned regularly to make sure that things can be changed as we go along. There need to be review provisions which are transparent so everybody understands them from the beginning. And you need to have safeguards against dominant players in the catchment, like a sort of upgraded version of the Commerce Commission, and some rules about whether or not you're going to allow foreign ownership. As I mentioned earlier, most New Zealand catchments are fully or over-allocated, both with respect to the quantity of water and the amount of capacity of the river to absorb pollutants. And the most efficient solution to those problems is really to line up all those permits to take and discharge and auction them at the end of a fixed period, so that a water price emerges and an allocation emerges from that auction process. But because that would be a big jolt for a lot of farm businesses particularly, you sometimes need to have a transition period. And that's especially the case, I suggest, for an element like nitrogen, to which farm profitability is very sensitive. And so we've had this use of things like grandparenting to provide a kind of transition period. There's a lot of complexity here which I won't go into, but what I simply wanted to say is you have to be a little bit careful about grandparenting, because sometimes vested interests will grab control of the decision-making process, and some big players, sometimes get privileges which are a bit more extensive than they really ought to be having. So you need to watch that allocation process. Gosh. Whoops. Sorry. I won't, let me just skip over these, because I think, Tina Perot has covered this all very well. In fact, I'll just skip right through these points because she said most of this. Okay, let me just pick it up at this point. How might a fair allocation be made? This is going to depend on some negotiations which haven't really yet begun between the iwi Chairs Forum and the Crown. And whatever they agree is going to take quite a long time to implement. It will need to treat existing permit holders in water fairly in order to avoid creating new injustices. It could be quite complex, but I think one element which is likely to emerge is a kind of cash settlement with iwi, which would enable iwi to buy tradable water permits over time. And in order for that to work, every region needs to have a very good understanding of its aquifers and waterways, sufficiently good that it can create a water market. So that, I think, sets a bit of an agenda for regional councils in terms of being able to address the challenge which the water settlement is eventually going to pose for you. This is a controversial topic on which the Land and Water Forum unfortunately couldn't reach agreement, but at the last election both Labour and the Greens said they would introduce a royalty charge on water users, and I believe from talking with their politicians that this is going to be in their policy for this coming election. The Labour one's going to be released at Havelock North next Friday. This would bring water into line with all the other kind of collectively owned resources that we have in this country, on all of which a royalty is paid. Even gravel taken out of rivers, you have to pay a royalty for that. So it isn't immediately obvious why we shouldn't have a royalty on water. And I think a key consideration which people don't fully understand is that when a regional council hands out a water permit, it is making a wealth transfer from the public balance sheet to a private owner's balance sheet. And so in Canterbury, the Regional Council has handed out $2.5 billion worth of water to private landowners who had to be millionaires just to be eligible to get the water, because unless you can satisfy the Regional Council that you've got a large farm which is irrigatable, you won't get the water. So this is a very selective transfer of wealth to people who are already wealthy. And that's, I think, rather fortified the belief that we ought really to charge people for this water. Let me, Lawrence is telling me I should wind up, so let me make this my last slide. I just wanted to say that we have to be quite careful about how we set these royalties, because if you do as the Greens said last election, that we're just going to stick a charge on the volume of water, then you're going to get a lot of people who can afford it very easily and a lot of people that will be put out of business. What we ought to be doing is charging for water by its value. And that's not too difficult to do, because the people who assess the value of properties are required under the law to assess the value of water separately from the value of the land. So they already know how much a water permit is worth, and you can ring quotable value and they'll tell you. And it varies, of course, a lot around the country and according to the kind of land use that you're involved with. But what this really means is that it wouldn't be too difficult for us to set up a royalty system that was based on the value of the water to the user, and the aim of that is not to take away the normal profit of a business. The aim is not to put anybody out of business. The aim is simply to take what the economists call a super profit, which is the profit over and above the normal business profit, which is generated by virtue of the scarcity of the resource. And if you think about the analogy with land, a farmer either owns a piece of land or leases a piece of land, pay rent for that. We're talking in a similar way about paying rent for water. And if you think about it that way, I think it has a certain logic. I had a few more slides here, which unfortunately I didn't get a chance. I was going a bit slowly, I guess. But I'll give this presentation to the organisers, and you can have a look at my thoughts about the polluter pays principle, if you wish, on their website. Thank you very much.
I now invite, thanks Guy very much, and sorry to cut you off, I know. But I now invite Will Foley, who's the President of Federated Farmers for Hawke's Bay, to come and give the farming perspective. Will.
Thank you, Mayor Yule, and yes, I'm Will Foley and current local Hawke's Bay President of Fed Farmers. I farm down in Central Hawke's Bay, come from born and bred Takapau, and still farming down there today. Feedlots, Havelock North Water, Ruataniwha Dam, I feel like I've got a pretty hard job, I guess, to convince you guys that that farmers do get it. They feel the media pressure and the public pressure on them at the moment, so yeah, I guess we'll go through the presentation and see how we go. So on that note, I'd like to congratulate the 4 entities that brought this forum together. And I think, you know, I've watched a few videos. I've only just got here just before lunch, but I've seen a bit of what's been spoken about. And I think it's important we look to the future, learn from our lessons, but definitely focus on what we can do to do better. And that certainly includes farmers. So I'll just cover my farm and I guess let you guys know that I'm more than just a spokesman, I'm definitely in the thick of it. Examining the challenges that farmers face and basically the future, what the future holds. So as I said before, I farm down Central Hawke's Bay, 3 different locations, all got different topography and slightly different climates. I put that picture up there because the biggest majority of my operation involves sheep, and for some crazy reason, my passion. The wool price this year is probably the lowest it's ever been, and lamb prices from the breeding flock this summer were pretty abysmal. So yeah, sheep farm's doing it tough at the moment. So at Takapau, on my father's side, I'm 4th generation. And that's a picture of Takapau rolling and some medium hill. Those 3 hills in the background with the rocks you can see on the other 3 sisters. So if you know the wine comes from the Ashworths down at Takapau, they're the 3 sister hills. So I've just put some notes there on the side, and I apologise about referring to Tukituk Plan Change 6, but I think with tank process ongoing and that plan change coming up, I think we can learn a lot from, I guess, you know, where we've come from with Tukituk and apply those lessons to tank. So in Tukituk we farm under LUC limits now, and based on that block and the way we farm, we're allowed just under 20 kilos nitrogen loss, and actual loss is 5. Phosphate is considered reasonably high, and that's largely due to the topography and the heavier soils. There's 2 waterways on that property. The Prongau stream runs on the boundary, and an open drain orbit starts on this property and ends up in the Maharakiki. Ongo, I farm a lease property there, so dead flat, slightly stony soils, very free draining, very warm in the winter. Because of the land class differences, there's a higher nitrogen loss allowance, but still well within that LUC system. And phosphate, very different just due to the flat terrain. There's one intermittent stream there. Last year it might have flowed for 2 to 3 weeks of the year. This year it's probably going to flow 3 to 4 months, so climate's pretty variable at the moment. And lastly, up at Carrera, so this farm's been passed down on my mother's side, 4th generation up here as well. That's a pretty unusual picture. That was January this year. And yeah, it's pretty much, probably go back to 1998 and 88 to see it as dry as that. So nitrogen's still okay there. Phosphorus very high due to the topography and the very high rainfall. So rainfall up there is about 1,600 mil a year. Down at Takapau it's more like 900. Other issues, erosion and lots of waterways, creeks and streams. That's a more normal scene, what you expect to see out there. So what's the process and steps with farmers engaging in water quality? So one is the awareness, and if there's anything I can get across to you today is that farmers are definitely aware of, I guess, the scrutiny, the attention they're getting, and on a day-to-day basis now, farmers are thinking about, I guess, in all of their decisions, you know, what impact are they having on the environment and what can they do about it? And that's definitely happening down in CHB with farmers needing to do farm environmental plans. Engagement, and I think, you know, if we look between Tukituk and Tank, engagement was definitely lacking down in Tukituk, and it's got to be a better outcome for farmers to be sitting around the table with other local stakeholders coming up with the solutions that we need. Focus on the values, so I guess there's been a huge focus on numbers, and in the Tukituk we all know about the 0.8 nitrogen level, and I guess if we look at the review that's just come out around Ruataniwha and Tukituk, we already know that that's probably unlikely to be achievable, and so one thing I'd I guess ask for is to focus more on the values that we're trying to achieve. Profitability, so I make no bones about the need for farmers to be profitable, I guess to achieve a lot of these environmental outcomes, because they do involve spending money, and so it's no different to a local council needing to spend money on sewage systems and things like that. The money needs to be there. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to matter which farming system you employ at the moment, profitability is quite variable. And same goes with local community outcomes too. So coming from Takapau, I've seen a massive decline from the 1980s when I went to primary school there, and you know, a thriving rural town with pretty much every service you needed without needing to go to Waipak. Now you have to go to Waipak, and I guess my biggest fear is one day will we get to the stage where, you know, we have to go to Hastings because Waipak's goes the same way. Focus on the hot spots, so that includes in the own farm system, there'll be areas that you can focus on straight away and get the biggest bang for your buck, and same in sub-catchment and catchment areas. And celebrate success. So we always hear about the things that go wrong. We see the photos of cattle in streams, etc. Let's celebrate that success more as well. So the challenges: nitrogen, phosphorus, stock exclusion, and water quantity. So by water quantity, I mean things like in summer, farms coming under pressure just with stock water. So dams drying up, not recharging through the winter, and springs and bores becoming an issue, just like we're seeing for urban use and industrial use as well. So nitrogen, what affects nitrogen? Stock class, sheep versus cattle, male versus female, fertiliser timing and application, so not applying fertiliser during wet months, where runoff will increase. Feed type, so we're starting to see work on different feed types affecting nitrate output, and particularly higher protein feeds relating to higher nitrate output. And efficiency of systems, so the quicker I can grow a cattle beast or a lamb, the shorter time it takes it's there, and so the less environmental footprint it has, and that can apply to many things. Phosphorus, so optimum soil phosphate levels, not applying phosphate fertiliser when your levels are already above economic optimum. Fertiliser type and timing, different phosphate fertilisers have different solubility, and once again not applying during the wet. Stock exclusion, so as well as stock in streams on the banks, it's generally wet and they'll pug that up and push sediment into the water. And stock class, so trying to avoid cattle on wet soils. And probably the point to make there around the feedlots, and it's the older farmers that tell me, but before my time, but it was considered best practice to start feedlots in the winter, getting them off the wet soils and pugging up. And so apparently that's where the feedlot system came from. Stock exclusion, so I agree, it's a no-brainer. Picture on the left is what's been happening. There's rules around it not happening in Tukituk anymore from 2020 on the lower slopes. There really isn't any reason why, farmers, it doesn't have to be permanent fencing. Temporary fencing can get cattle out immediately. Picture on the right is obviously ideal with riparian planting. That's not in the rules at this stage, but once again, seems like a no-brainer. Offers more benefits around catching nutrients and shading of the water. So this is probably my favourite part of the presentation, and it's innovation. So we do hear extreme views around, stopping complete farming systems, and that's all they are, is they're extreme. There is things happening, and I'm confident things will continue to happen around innovation. So that picture on the top left is this post here, and this is due to be released at the field days next couple of weeks' time. So you've seen it here first. This is from Gallagher, New Zealand's successful company here and overseas, and they've just invented this post, and it can replace a quarter-round wooden post. And so a lot of the stock exclusion rules are on the lower land and not up in the hills, and that's because the hills are almost in the too hard basket at the moment. You have to helicopter posts up. They're big, bulky, attractor to ram, and even then you may not get a tractor on the hill, and so lots of digging. So here's a post that can be obviously carried easy, rammed in. It's got a long lifetime, the same costs as a post, but none of the extra costs. And so here's an example of where, we could get to a stage where we can fence off creeks on steep hills and whatnot effectively and economically. picture on the right's plantains. I talked about forages affecting nitrate output, particularly in cattle. And the bottom two pictures, so Massey University is doing a lot of work. At the moment, the technology is quite heavy, so they're not doing it on drones, they're doing it in a plane, but they can basically take a snapshot of your farm and create maps, sort of like what's on the right there, detailing your nutrient around your whole farm. And so if it was phosphate, you can basically, if it's plain or truck spreader, you know, and it's connected to the GPS and it's got this map loaded, it can basically decrease and increase the food application. So none's going on where it doesn't need to be and getting wasted, and only going on where it will be utilised. So moving forward, community catchment partnerships, it's all about engagement with the community. So Tukituk, we saw commissioners come from out of the area, perhaps didn't always know what they were talking about and certainly didn't know the area. It'd be much better if community partnerships come together and come up with what we want. Fund more monitoring and research. So I've got the need to build trust. So there's a lot of to-ing and fro-ing from each side. But we can only get better around our data and our numbers. What effect are we having, and what improvements are we making from what we're doing? Engaging the community and farmers. So I guess make sure the community knows already the good work going on, because as I said before, they always hear the negative press. And prune up the rules and beef up the partnership. So ideally, non-regulation. Let's be one step ahead of regulation, adaptive planning, and own the data and own the results. So, I guess be one step ahead of the council rather than waiting for them to come to us and telling us what we need to do. And that's the end.
Good on, Will. Well, I'll just make an observation while you're there. You're actually amongst friends here. This has been a very constructive couple of days, and everybody's been very respectful. And I don't want you to feel that there's been a beat up of farmers. In fact, I don't think that has happened at all. So thank you for coming, and please feel that you're not being got at. I made some observations yesterday about urban challenges as well. So, all right. Jeff Van Beek will give us a user perspective on irrigation, and Jeff, I think you are fully responsible for the Twyford Water User Agreement. I will give you that credit, and that effectively also came out of a crisis. So it's nice to have you here.
It's the graveyard shift, so it's not easy. First of all, these guys never had an excuse to be late, because actually there's a clock sitting here, so they should have known. So that's
and they're not, and nor will you be.
And then I saw Guy Foley walking in with the stick, and I thought, well, that's actually not a stick. That possibly is an ancient warrior Maori spear that he's actually going to have a go at, Gallagher made it. Oh, well, here you go. Shows you that I can sometimes be wrong too. Okay, Jeff Van Beek rhymes with sheriff, so it makes it a bit easier to pronounce. I come from Holland. I'm an agricultural civil engineer by trade. I came here as a 21-year-old. It was my dream since I was 11. My father was a dairy farmer, and he was a dairy farmer from way back in the 1500s. Our farm belonged to us. And was in our family. I lived on the river. The river was the IJssel, and sometimes we lived in the river. And the reason for that was because we're actually on a floodplain. So when the ice melt and the rain was just too much in Switzerland and in France and in Germany, they would actually use our farm as an area to actually have that excess of water go, so that the towns wouldn't be flooded. So we actually lived on an area that was raised, and on Sundays we would jump on the tractor with the whole family, and we would go to church. It's the only way we could do it, because the water was just too high to get the car through. So that's a bit of my background. Also, as you see here, there are my 10 lovely mokopuna, my grandchildren, and it's the reason I sometimes get emotional, because I've had the opportunity to come to New Zealand and settle myself here with my family. Although my family was born here, I met my lovely wife Carla while here in New Zealand. But it's been an amazing blessing and dream to be here. And hopefully you see that a little bit. The house behind the kids there is actually a straw bale house that was built with the timber that was actually on the land right in Twyford. The table that they're leaning on was one of 12 makarapa trees that we milled on site and built the house off. And if you ever want to come and have a look, come and have a look. And we definitely have a lot of people that take an interest. So actually our footprint doesn't actually have to be big. You can actually have 5 children and not even have an electric stove, because that's what we not have. We have got a wood stove because we're orchardists. We've got plenty of wood, and we don't put it through the mulch. We actually put it in through the stove. So we have central heating right through the house. It's fantastic. So you can actually have 5 children and a dog and still have a small footprint. Okay? Go. Let's get into it. Now, Guy did a fantastic job. He never failed on this little thing. He had a lovely tablet with him like I had. And remember, it was the farmers in the olden days, they were actually the dumb kids that stayed home and the clever ones went to university. It's the other way around now, I feel, because you have to be really clever to be able to actually run a farm these days with what we have to put up with. And I definitely don't think that I'm clever myself. I'm really fortunate that I actually can stand on the shoulders of very many able people that have helped me in setting up. And I haven't got a lot of time, but I'll go through it quickly. My first orchard that I bought, I didn't own the hide ladders, I didn't own the picking buckets, I didn't own the truck, the forklift. And even the land wasn't mine yet, because in those days you had to go through the land settlement court. I was an alien, I was called, and I had to prove that actually was going to be staying here for long, and so that I was allowed to buy more than 2 hectares of land. So I hadn't even paid for the land yet. So one of my clients, I was a contractor at the time, drove in, wind down his window. Young people, this is actually how we used to do it in the olden days. Wind down his window, and he said, Van Beek, why don't you just go and borrow an orchard, you know, because you could see all this borrowed stuff that was there. But that's what people did, you know. Rex Graham's father, Plateau Orchard, the truck that I used to take the fruit to the pack house was his truck. I never had to put diesel in it. And I asked him what he needed for it. He says, just, I can see you're a goer, have a good go. And I did, and I'm really grateful for that. And it's the same thing here. I set a tank, and I learned so much from the people who are there. And also, I often use the theory of walking in the moccasins. We've done that now for 4 years. I've walked in the moccasins of the environmentalist. I'm one too, by the way, and we all are, I believe. I've walked in the moccasins of our local iwi, and I've learned a lot. And hopefully that maybe shows a little bit of where we got to in our particular area. What you see today is mainly my view, but I'm the chair of the Twyford Irrigator Water Group, and I think, well, they haven't kicked me out yet, so I must be going on something good, you know? So here we go. So as you can see, horticulture versus agriculture, and sorry, Guy, we are a little bit different here. Agriculture makes life possible, horticulture makes life pleasurable, okay? That's just the difference. We have very low nitrogen inputs and nutrient inputs. We are very strictly adhered to by the GAP systems. The shelves in Europe and now also in China, Taiwan, are very determining us to make sure that we are able to follow procedures that actually look after the resource. And when this started, an English housewife, what did she want to know about my first aid box and that I had 16 plasters in there? That's what it was like, and it made me really angry. But I tell you what, it made us a lot better farmers and orchardists because we have to follow it through. And the resources are the same, and labour is now attached to it as well, which is another hat I'm wearing, and don't ask me because otherwise I'll go over that time there. Intensification is happening in horticulture, and that's for a reason. And it's to do with scarcity of land, but also the cost of labour, cost of water, and so forth. See, I'm not as good as these guys. So what about intensification? One thing you need to do is give up golf. You need to be there all the time. You need to have your finger on the pulse. You need to have the technology to be able to run it, okay? Use of irrigation is reducing in those areas. You wouldn't believe it, but it is. And I'll show you a photo why. And it's mainly to do with, because it's so expensive, the rootstocks that we're using and the amount that we're now planting of trees, these are little racehorses. And if you mistreat them, they mistreat you. So the water that you actually give them and the nutrients and the training that you give them and the support structure has to be spot on, otherwise they'll punish you. And that's why I've given up golf. And then we're talking mainly here about the modern rootstocks. A good planting of apples will cost now in the vicinity of $180,000. Not the land, but actually what you see when you drive past. That's how much it costs to get to full production. That's a lot of money. And if you have got a cyclone coming through and you have skimmed on your post, the thing could actually end up on the deck and you have to start all over again. In our area, and I can't speak of all areas, broadacre cropping is reducing. And what it actually is doing, because the land is so valuable now, that permanent crops are taking priority and the broadacre crops are being diminished. So these things we won't see as much anymore in our area at this particular time. Things change, and Guy, I definitely think that there will come a time that we will actually be back in the slumps again, and that maybe wool is back up again. But at the moment, we've got 5 years of a golden run, and we're doing really well. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we continue to do well, and that's something we are really planning going forward. So this is our view. It's a broad view. It's a community responsibility, and we're not saying just us farmers either. I really am enjoying Tank and the process that we're going through, that we actually learn from one another and what we need together to make this resource the best resource we can. It's a shoulder to shoulder, and it's been talked about before, and maybe it's helpful if you're one of the graveyard shift speakers that you actually can add a few things that you heard before that actually sounds pretty good. But at least you can say he's learned something from being here. I believe this is not actually a regulator space. I think it's an us space. Do we want to go back to, and you see it there, and those who are at Tank may identify with this, we did not want to go back to the hello period, okay? And you can hear the people here in the corner actually were there. Really powerful. And what I'm trying to say, hello, how you do? These are the people who actually settled this land. And they were actually the lords of England and actually brought their laws here. We actually, as Kiwis, we need to make sure that we actually develop together the outcome of the use of the resource. And some will be aggrieved by that, so be it. But if we go back to the regulation where we have just one regulator and one law that cannot be changed, we all be the worst from it. So I personally see, and not everybody agrees with me, that the Water Conservation Order on the main stem of the Ngāroa is a hello type of regulation, okay? So our view, and it's predominantly my view, I look at the Karamu, and although I live in Twyford, I'm part of the Karamu catchment because all our runoff actually ends up through the Raupari into the Karamu, into the Clive, okay? So I'm part of the Karamu, and I'm not proud of it. Although when I look at the Raupari, it's a beautiful, pristine little stream or drain, whatever you want to call it, and we want to keep it that way, and we actually want to improve it, and we're working on improving it. We will acknowledge and respect tangata whenua in this particular space. We have to. I've learned this lesson. I've driven hours and hours with a very good colleague of mine, George Rareri. And George has taught me that I could come when I was 21 and I can leave tomorrow, I can sell my farm and orchard, but they can't. And I think that's the lesson that I've learned, and you've got to understand as well. From a European perspective, we can buy and sell. Here we can't, and that's what I've learned. And that's why I appreciate that we actually working together and come to understand this through the Tank process. And sorry that I get a bit emotional about this because it's dear to my heart. The future growth, I think, will happen, but what will that look like? And the growth often is aligned with water, because water is so important. And I believe we have solutions. And the solutions are that we are able to actually, definitely through high flows, we can store water away. Personally, I have not spent the time to get my head around Ruataniwha, because I wanted to concentrate on our area. And I didn't want to actually be taken into that discussion. And even during the council elections, I stayed out of that area. We may have seen as being pro or against. We generally weren't, and I definitely am not. But I feel that if we work with the scientists, if we work with the iwi, there are solutions here. If we can actually store away water during very high flows, that we actually can release back into the river and streams, so that we actually negate the effect that we're having now, or that the effect that we are actually going to create through increased water take due to increased intensive planting, for instance. I don't think it will happen, and I'll show you why in a minute. I think all water users need to adopt best practice. That's the GAP systems I talked about before, and these will be ramped up. They won't stop here where we are. They will continue to increase. We're now adding labour to it. So how are we treating our labour? So we're actually going to be surveyed, but also we'll have people coming in and coming through our books just to make sure that we actually, for instance, something really simple, a pay break. Somebody is on a contract, picks bins, earns $40 an hour. When he stops for his 15 minutes of smoko, he gets $15.75. The guy is an athlete, or the girl, and he should be paid for what he's worth. When he has a break, we should pay him accordingly. That's where we're at with the New Zealand law, and we need to do this. Our industry, the horticulture industry, is advancing at a very rapid pace. And we are now actually at the moment going surveying all our horticulture producers to what their pay rates are. We as an industry, we're in a golden run. Are we passing on that golden run? Are they actually seeing increases in their wages? And if they're not, I'm pretty well sure we will have tools through, for instance, the RSC scheme that we have, where we bring Pacific Island people in to come and work here and take that money home after seven months. We have ways to turn the tap on and off, to use a pun. So we will have tools to be able to do that. And I think it's more than fair, because our GAP systems will demand it from us anyhow. So we actually need to be ahead of what our customers would want from us. Okay. I'll go quickly through this. 1982, I stepped on a farm, and my boss at the time said, "This is the best land in the world. You can't get any better." Being an arrogant Dutch guy, 21-year-old agriculture civil engineer, I knew better, I thought. But Rex Graham was right. He was my boss at the time, and I now live only 500 metres from that particular farm where I've got 2 orchards, and it is the best. And we're the number one production system in the world now 3 years running, and that's based on how we actually produce our produce. And I'm talking about pip fruit here. And if you would create an environment anywhere in the world to grow pip fruit, it's Hawke's Bay. You couldn't think it any better. And water is a really key factor of that. So we have got some real good benefits. And what that does also is we are the highest producing on a per hectare basis. What that means, we have more labour per hectare working for us, something that we as horticulture are very proud of. We use 10 times more labour on a per hectare basis, and it's close to that also in revenue than, for instance, agriculture does right across on an average. So we actually are a very good solution for some of the issues that we have maybe here in Hawke's Bay that are the social issues that we can overcome by actually giving our young people a chance to actually have a career in the industry. What we're also doing is riparian planting. In the Twyford area, we have got a plan with the Hawkesbury Regional Council that we actually will plant the Rauparī stream and its tributaries, and we're well on the way of planting that. Unfortunately, it's a little bit slower than we would like it to be, but the hang-up is with the Hawkesbury Regional Council. It's not our fault, of course.
Moving along.
Okay. In practice. One thing that I just want to say, consented volume versus used volume are not the two same things, okay? They're totally different. So you've got on your consented water, but what you actually use is totally different. And I think we've already been to the moon. We now actually have got telemetry. We've got meters in place on a per quarter hour basis. We can work out how much water we use. So why don't we actually go to an allocation system where we actually on actual use and get away from the consented volume, because it doesn't make sense. Since a day and a half now we've been talking about 50% of the water is being used by irrigators. Well, it's not true if we would go by actual use. So I've got a picture to show you that. So the technology is here, and what does collaboration look like? Very quickly. This is the Twyford area, unconfined, semi-confined, and the confined area. The semi-confined area and the unconfined area have got a global consent. All the consents are into one pot. So there's no trading going on. They're into one pot, owned by Twyford Cooperative Limited. And when we irrigate, anyone can irrigate in those particular red lines who belongs to the global water consent. And so if you have no water, because your father filled in the documentation wrong, didn't have his glasses on, and he says 1 litre rather than 100 litres, and he's got no water, he can now actually make use of the combined water without actually having to share it as such legally. It's quite complicated. Hopefully you've heard about it. It's talked about right across New Zealand because it's 60 growers, consent holders, who actually joined their water and they're sharing it, but they still keep ownership of it. This is the flow during January. As you can see, the red line is the minimum flow. We were able to keep the minimum flow above that red line on a daily mean by augmenting. So we use water that actually is part of the global consent, so the total water. We use some of that water and put it into the Rauparī to keep it up. Oxygen was higher than the flow itself, and temperature was lower than the flow itself. So we actually improved the quality of the stream, and at the same time we kept it up as well. If we would have not augmented, that stream would have been close to 40 days below minimum flow, and therefore we wouldn't have been able to irrigate. So I think that's what looks like a win-win situation. And this is a collaborative coming together of growers, but I think why community should actually be part of that as well. Here is, once again, daily mean flow, and you see twice we actually made a little mistake, didn't put enough water in the stream, and you get punished, and we were put on ban. Here's another particular day that we were put on ban that's just magnified one of those 2 days. Sorry, I'll just go back. So I'm not sure if that's big enough. If you can see, the circle there shows us the total water used. As you know, it was a very, very dry year. A lot of wells, due to their hardware, were out of water, not in Twyford, fortunately. But as you can see, we pumped as hard as we could to maintain our water in the water profile, where our ground profile, where the trees are. And as you can see, we only used 45% of the consented volume. So Tom Balfour, of course, when he sees this, always asks me the question, so does that mean you can actually reduce your totally consented water? It's not a problem. We can. It's not an issue, because we have got water in the tank. And if we have got a surety of water, then the behaviour of us growers, irrigators, is far more in line with actually the environment can withstand. Before we had the water, the global consent, and we knew in 2 days' time or 3 days or 4 days' time there will be a ban on, what we do, we would chuck everything at it. We just flood the orchard and try to put as much water on so that we would have enough storage in that water profile to last during the ban. Well, that's totally and utterly stupid use of water, wouldn't you think? So that's why we came up with this scheme of the global consent. So now we have got a surety of water. Now we actually put water on that our little race horses need. So we have enough water on, and even close to harvest time, we actually pull our watering back, our irrigation back, because we actually want to finish off the crop. Okay, but during the bans, that was not possible. We either had all the water or none of the water, and it just didn't make sense. Okay, just quickly go through. So here you see another picture of the little circle. I like picture language, as you possibly have figured. Here is another example of how much water we used in blue, and the red line is where our total consented volume was. So I think we've got a lot of room to actually talk and speak about how the future will look like. That was me. Thank you very much.
I just remind you, I can't remember what year it was, Giraffe. 12-13. There was pictures of young trees dying. We couldn't water them. Actually, there was plenty of water there under this model, but we didn't use it smartly. So Giraffe, largely, his regime has got it together, and now there's not a problem. So that's how you can do things smartly and differently. And also, I wanted to say, and Giraffe, correct me if I'm wrong as well, we had some from Sean Bevan this morning. Horticulture was worth about $10,000 to the hectare, they thought. My understanding is envy. Apples are around profitable to around $100,000 a hectare at the moment. So up higher, even more. So it is a very valuable crop. What I'm saying is, while you looked at 10,000, it might sound like much. At the moment, these apples are rocketing with the right varieties. So, right, it's afternoon tea time. We're running a little bit late. If there's any questions of these guys, just see them over afternoon tea, and we'll see you back at about 10 to. All right, thank you.